This is the RSPB reserve at Arne in Dorset, and it lays on the edge of Poole Harbour. And I'm here to find out about the project to relocate ospreys from Scotland to the south of England. Currently, they are doing very well indeed, because they have a nest, a breeding pair and chicks. So this is a massive step forward for the project, which so far has been running for about 5 years. Success of this translocation of ospreys from Scotland must feel pretty amazing to you at the moment.
It's such an incredible result for us. We're so thrilled. It is the culmination of what's probably 6 or 7 years of hard work by a very dedicated team of people from Birds of Poole Harbour, the charity that I work for, and the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation, a charity based up in the Highlands of Scotland. And everything we've done so far has ultimately been to get to this point where we have a pair of ospreys on a nest with chicks here on the south coast of England for the first time since 1847.
So how did the project get started initially?
So historically, ospreys would have been here in Poole Harbour, and they would have been across much of the south coast of England, across much more of Europe than they currently are. And the only reason they're not here anymore, or weren't until recently, was because of human persecution over the last 2 or 3 centuries. So they went extinct as a breeding species in southern England in 1847 and in Scotland in 1916. And then followed a period of about 40 years where there were no breeding ospreys in the whole of the UK. Fortunately, they naturally recolonised Scotland, and the population there has grown quite healthily. But sadly, they don't spread very rapidly in terms of their population growth. So it's going to take at least another 60 years or so, we estimate, before they disperse naturally into these areas. And the thing is, they should be here. So what we want to do, and what we have been doing for the last 5 years, is using a conservation tool to reintroduce them to an area where they historically would have been and should be to present day.
Certainly plenty of food for them in this area.
Absolutely, yes. Poole Harbour is the perfect place for ospreys. It's a natural estuary. There's lots of different rivers feeding into here. It's a mixture of salt water and fresh water. So there's loads of species like mullet, bass, flounder, loads of different species that ospreys can take, and they are very generalist. So they do only eat fish, so they do require water bodies, but within that they are very generalist. They will take a huge variety of fish, and Poole Harbour absolutely offers that variety.
So where will the project go from here?
Well, the only way is up, really. So we've now got 1 pair breeding locally on a nest, which is on private land, but hopefully soon, within the next 5 years, we'll get 1 or 2 more pairs establishing in other places around the harbour. And we've put up lots of artificial nesting sites in trees and on poles, like the one here at the RSPB Arne Reserve, that we're hoping that other pairs are going to start occupying. And that's going to be because they're going to be attracted into an area where there's already breeding ospreys. So hopefully the population will increase exponentially after that point, and maybe within 10 or 20 years we're aiming to have around 10 breeding pairs locally here in Poole Harbour. That's roughly the number we think the area could sustain.
Ospreys are really one of these sort of prestigious sort of birds that everybody wants to see in the UK. So you think, in terms of the facility here at Arne and around Poole Harbour, that it will bring in a lot of people that are interested in birds and wildlife generally?
Absolutely. Poole Harbour is an excellent place for wildlife in general, but ospreys really just have that little extra bit of wow that lots of people want to see. So we will know that in the future we're already running boat trips locally, taking people out on the harbour to actually see these birds where they're fishing, where they're hunting in the local area. We'll definitely start to see an increase in people visiting sites like this, anywhere else in the harbour where the birds will be, which is really anywhere where there's shallow water, the birds will end up hunting in those areas. And hopefully one day we'll have a pair breeding on a site where we can take members of the public to actually go and see these phenomenal birds on their nests, and that will be something really special. and their conservation has been really quite interesting historically. It's a species that's found on every continent of the world with the exception of Antarctica, but it's one that's still to this day given a huge amount of conservation attention and funding, and I thought that was quite an interesting discussion. So I was supposed to write 4,000 words, I wrote 20,000 words. I don't think anyone read it all the way through, but what did happen was that my school teacher handed it over to an old student of his, and that actually turned out to be Paul Morton, who is one of the co-founders of the charity I now work for, Birds of Poole Harbour. That summer I did some work monitoring the ospreys locally in Poole Harbour, and that work formed the foundation for the application that we then put in to translocate ospreys to Poole Harbour, because what we wanted to demonstrate was that this was an area that could sustain a really good number of ospreys.
Have you been up to Scotland to see what they do up there?
I've been very fortunate to visit Scotland on one occasion during the osprey breeding season, but actually I was there to help collect the osprey chicks for the part of the translocation. So I was a very flying visit, but I do know a lot about the conservation of ospreys in Scotland because it is really the birthplace of the conservation of the species in this country. There was a very bold decision taken by a gentleman called George Waterston, who was in charge of Loch Garten, which is the site that the ospreys recolonised in the 1950s for the first time. He decided to open up the viewing of the single osprey nest, the only one in the country, to viewing by members of the public, despite a lot of people advising him against it. And actually what happened was fantastic, was because people came to that site, they observed the ospreys, and in doing so they actually helped protect the nest from potential persecution, from egg robbers, and actually they became custodians of that nest, and people continue to go back there in their thousands to this day, 70 years later. And ever since then, sites all over the country where ospreys have now re-established, people are very much a part of that conservation story, and that's what we hope to see here in Poole Harbour over the coming decade.
There is certainly no shortage of fish in and around Poole Harbour, so to have ospreys here breeding and perhaps raising a good number of clutches for the next few years, which will in turn mean that more of those young will come back and be hunting in the waters of Poole Harbour.